Alrighty, we come off mute, switch scene. You can see both of us. Awesome. Get rid of the glass, so no glare. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining. Oh, I got feedback coming. I can hear myself. Right, I've muted the stream. That was distracting. Speaking in hearing yourself is always confusing. Cool. Awesome. Thanks all for joining. I'm Adam Cook, and this is the PowerShell Southampton user group, of course, doing it virtually. Jacob, quick introduction by you, maybe?
Yeah, sure. Hi. Hello, everyone. I'm Jakub. I'm owner of Pester, and I will be showing you Introduction to Pester today. So hope you're ready for it.
And what do you think? Maybe 45 minutes, 60 minutes in length, I think, right?
Yeah, it should be around 45, 60 minutes. Depends on how fast I will go through the code. And there will be a QA at the end, or you can raise your questions in the chat, and they will be relayed to me almost in real time.
Yeah, absolutely. No, just to kind of follow up on that, on the side, there is a chat window. By all means, get involved. Jakub has said that he's happy for me to interrupt him with any questions you guys ask, and I'll reload those on. I think you're keen for quite an interactive session, right? So what we've actually got at the end, in the QA session, at the end of the session, I'll share a little short link on screen, and you can kind of browse through it, and that'll redirect you to join this Teams meeting that Jakub and I currently are in, so that you can kind of ask questions in chat. If you like, you can join the stream if you wanted to do it over mic, but otherwise you can use the chat. One last thing is quality. So I always make this point right at the start of the stream. In case you didn't know, you can actually adjust the quality in YouTube. So just hover over the video that you see us now, and there'll be a settings cog in the corner. Click on that, go to quality, and you can bump it up to the stream the quality that we're currently kicking out at, which is at full HD, which is you'll probably want when we start looking at code and going in the editor and stuff. So that'd be cool. Yeah, okay. So before we hand over, let me switch to my window capture here. Just want to kind of share that we've got a website now, pssouth.co.uk. It's been kind of like in the works for a little while now, but I kind of polished it off last night, ready for this, and I just wanted to share it to let you know that it exists. So here's the website. In here you can find out a little bit more about the group, past and upcoming events, a link to the meetup page, and also check out our sponsors as well. We actually have one new sponsor who is sponsoring, I guess, give them a shout out here in this session, is Patch My PC. Full disclosure, they're my employer. So a quick blurb about Patch My PC as they're kind of help contribute towards the user group and make it run today. Is they're a third-party patching provider, or we are a third-party patching provider. So we integrate into Microsoft Intune and Configuration Manager to create apps and updates, so we can automate the process of third-party patching. So patchmypc.com, check us out. But that is much as I will say for sponsors, because the real meat and potatoes of this session will be Jakub's session 4, Introduction to Pester. So let's get the ball rolling. So let me switch screen here to your screen and video. So far away. Take it over.
Cool, great. Hi, I can see that you can see my intro slide on your screens already. So my name is Jakub Jareš, and I'm owner of Pester, and I've been owner of Pester for a long time. So I hopefully know a thing or two about Pester. I've been with it for maybe like almost 10 years. So hello, if you need any questions about Pester answered, let me know. You can do so by sending me a DM on Twitter at nohvnd. My DMs are open, so I just need to accept your question. You can also send questions to PS Pester, or you can send me an email to me at jakubjareš.com. I will definitely be grateful if you follow me on Twitter as well, because I don't know, I care about that. I work on Pester on weekends and during evenings when I have time, but by day I'm a developer at Microsoft. I actually work on something that's testing related, which is a VS Test platform, which is powering execution of tests under Visual Studio, and the MS Test Microsoft testing framework. Small disclaimer, all the opinions are my own, not Microsoft's, obviously. So let's get to it. Let's start with introduction to Pester. Hopefully we will get from the first concepts to mocking in just 1 hour. There are multiple versions of this talk already published, and they all use different examples. There is also documentation with another quick start. So if you need more encouragement to start or more different approaches to starting, then look up those talks. I will be linking to them later as well. And you can have different ways of introducing yourself to Pester. So hopefully that will be useful for you. Now, what is Pester? Pester is a testing module for PowerShell. That sounds very generic, but it's actually just a normal module as every other module. It exports some functions, even though the functions have quite strange names, but it's no magic. Everything is powered just by PowerShell, and I will show you the syntax, each step that you need to take to start with Pester. Now, Pester wasn't always the only testing framework for PowerShell. When I joined Pester, there were multiple of them. And actually, at that time, I had no idea what unit testing or testing is in general. I just knew that I'm doing some actions manually all the time and trying to make sure that the code that I wrote for power management on PCs works. And it was never working. I was just repeating manual tests across different operating systems all day. And every time I found like, oh, it doesn't work on Vista, or it doesn't work on Windows 7, or it doesn't work on Windows 2010 at that time. And I just was missing some automation of this. So I searched Google, I found testing and found testing for PowerShell. There were like 5 different testing frameworks, and Pester just simply had most of the features. So I started learning that, wrote some tests in it, and then ended up creating my first pull request on GitHub, which was actually changing colors for the output in Pester, because at that time I was using Power GUI, and that had 2 different skins, the light one and the dark one. And in the light one, you couldn't really see what is being printed to the screen. So I thought, oh, I will change the colors. And that's how my whole journey with Pester started. And then I ended up inheriting the whole code base, popularizing it on PS Mac. Then Dave White joined, that you probably heard about. Then Adam wrote a book about Pester. And then it started picking up in popularity. So that's probably why you are here now. You already heard about Pester. You already heard about it as the standard tool for testing PowerShell code. So there are 2 major versions of Pester floating around. The first one is Pester 5, which is much newer, but less used, and Pester 4, which is older, proven, and used in most places. But if you are starting now, start with Pester 5. And this presentation will also be just about Pester 5. There are some small differences, not huge differences, and you can find info about them in our documentation page. But be aware that most online content talks about Pester 4, and if you're just copy-pasting code, you might face some problems. The biggest difference being on the top of your script or of your test script, you need to use a before all block to put your code that imports your function. And that's like the biggest difference between Pester 5 and Pester 4. But if you're starting right now, start with Pester 5. It's developed actively. It has more features. It has much better integration with Visual Studio Code. It has logging for mocks and all of that. And I will also show you all of that. So if that opens in the right window, and I will go and switch to this one. So this is our documentation page. It's on pester.dev, and you can click on that, or you can click on Get Started. And this is one quick start guide that tries to describe everything about getting started with Pester. starting from a first function, writing a test, what each step means, what it means in like human terms instead of like testing terms. So this should be a good guide for you if for some reason this presentation doesn't stick with you and doesn't help you understand.
One thing I just want to say, Jakub, is just how good I found the docs. Like I said to you before the call, I went back to the docs a couple of months ago, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading them, and I found it gave a really good picture. And if there was ever any curiosity about the differences between version 4 and 5, there's nice snippets around the docs that kind of give you heads up, and it's good background info, I find. So docs are good.
Thank you. That's awesome. Really nice to hear, because like I wrote this one for like 4 days before I was happy about it, and now I'm happy about it.
Some docs try and oversimplify things sometimes, but I felt like, yeah, very good. I learned it all very well. Yeah, very good.
Let's skip. Okay. So how do you get started? Apart from watching talks and reading the quick start guide, you can also start on your own code. Just find a module or a script that you care about and that you know how to test manually, and then write those manual steps into code. Just translate them like, I need to create a file here. I need to read it using this function. It will give me this output. I can use the EQ operator to check if the output is the same. And if it's not the same, throw an exception. And that's basically a test. The only problem with this is that you can run only one test per file or per session, because when you throw an exception, it will stop and it will terminate your session, or it will stop the execution of the script, and you will get a red message on your screen. So now if you put it in a try catch and you write the message to the screen and you continue to the next one, you basically wrote a testing framework. So that's the basic idea even behind Pester. Execute pieces of code, make sure that if something unexpected happens, we throw an exception, we catch it, write it to the screen, and go to the next task. So if you have such code, then definitely try doing something like this. If you don't have such code, then after watching this presentation, you might sit down, you might remember the basic pieces that I show you in this presentation, and without picking too much at my code, try to replicate the same thing, because it's sometimes very different when you watch it on the screen and when you actually sit down and try to do it yourself. So this example should be complicated enough for you to have some trouble doing it, but also similar enough to real life systems where you will be doing the same techniques, but also simple enough for me to show you on the screen within like 5 lines of code or 10 lines of code. Okay, so installing Pester. On Windows 11, there's very old version built in, as well as on Windows 10, it's version 3 or 3.4, and you definitely need to update it to version 5. For that, you can just use install module and just grab it directly from PowerShell gallery. And you can also delete the old version. If you go to my GitHub, then there is this gist, which you just run as admin and will try to delete all the files. They are system files, so it's a bit more difficult getting rid of them, but the script automates this for you. So very easy to run on all your Windows 11 installations, because almost no one wants to run that old Pester. And with Pester installed on our system, we can finally talk about the syntax. It's just few, even though rather unusual words for a PowerShell commandlet, but they are just functions. They're just doing the same thing as a get command would be doing, or get process. They just have weird names and weird structure. The first one is should. Should is such called assertion. It's just a glorified equality check or some other check that will throw an exception when the value on the expected side and the actual side are not the same. So if we look at our example, we have a string which says a ###b, And then we run it through some function that we wrote that we are testing, which is called replace dash hashtag. And we say replace it with stars. Then if we get an output, we would expect to get A star 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 B. And we can write that down as should dash B and provide the exact string. And now we wrote a single test. The should in here acts as an assertion, and it doesn't do anything special. It only checks if the expected and the actual value are the same in a unified way. And if they are not the same, it throws an exception. And you can do your assertions the same way. You need a custom assertion that is checking that the time that was from the start to the end is less than something. There is no operator for should. Write a function that throws an exception if it's not acceptable timeout. Or you need number in a range. Write a function that does the same thing. If it's not in a range, throw an exception. You don't really have to rely that much on should be and its operators. We're just trying to make it a bit nicer for you to write unified tests. The next word that we are using is it, and it represents in Pester a single test. As I said before, if you just throw an exception, it will stop the test execution or the script execution, so you need to catch it somehow and put it inside of a sum block. And we do exactly that by using it. In code, it looks like this. It's a function called it, which takes two parameters. The first one is name, which is a string, and you can put whatever in there that describes what you are doing in your test. And then it takes a script block, which is the body of your test that you will execute once you want to run the test. We took our previous code and we just put it inside of this it block. Internally, it works similar to this. We grab a name as a parameter, we grab a test as a script block as a parameter, we run it inside of a try-catch block, and we throw away all the output using the assignment to null and executing it using the ampersand execution operator. And then if that doesn't throw an exception, we can go to the next line, which writes the green message. If it throws an exception, we will go into the catch and we will write the red message to the screen. In the real code, it's more complicated because we are doing a lot of other stuff around there, but this is totally the basic idea. You catch an exception, you write the message to the screen at the right time, you have yourself a testing framework. If you want to take all of the code from this presentation and write it into a tiny module, you can have a testing framework in under 100 lines of code very easily. Once you have more than 5 or 10 tests, you probably want to group them somehow so you can express better which tests belong together and which tests are testing different things around the same function. And for that, we have another block, another function, which is called describe and context. There is a lot of confusion around describe and context, but they are totally the same thing. There is a single place in Pester where we distinguish between describe and context, and that's if you call mock with scope parameter. That's the only place where we check if the function that was called is actually describe or context. In any other context, you can just use them totally interchangeably. And I will be just using describe in all of my code from now on, just to make it a little less confusing. But you can nest describe and describe and describe the same way you can nest context, describe, whatever you want. You are required to have at least one describe inside of your test file. This is a limitation that's new to Pester 4, I guess. It wasn't a limitation in Pester 3, but it just made our lives easier and it just makes your test look more unified. So you will just, in this case, just wrap your test in a describe block and it will invoke your test. You can put multiple tests inside of this describe block, which is the whole reason to have it. And if you want to have more grouping or more nesting, you just add describe blocks as you see fit. So if you have 5 tests that are testing the same thing on this function, just put them in this describe. If you have 5 tests that test some other thing on the same function, put them also in the describe. There is a convention that people tend to use, and that's naming the top-level describe, the one that's on the top of the file, with the name of the function that's being tested. In this case, it's replace-#. Internally, it looks similar to the it block, but we're not catching any exceptions. We just grab the name, write it to the screen, and then we execute the code of the block and throw away all the output. This is not totally true for Pester 5. We actually capture the output and we give it all that information on the output object, but this is a scheme of how it works. Now you have groups of tests, and you maybe start seeing some similarities in between your tests, or there is something that needs to happen before all of those tests are run, or maybe there is something that you need to do after all the tests were run. And for that, we have special blocks that will guarantee you that the stuff that you need to do after the test will actually happen after the test, even if you have tests failing. Those blocks are for doing common work before and after test, and they ensure, as I said, that everything in after will still work, will still run. And they are also inherited to all the child blocks and tests that you have. So if you have multiple levels of describe and you put your before all on the top where you import a script, it will run once. If you put before each in the next describe, it will be inherited and it will run before every test in the subsequent scopes. And you can also combine them. You put before each on the top and then you put before each like 2 levels down, and they will combine. So you will first run the first one and then you will run the second one and then you will run your test. They actually run in the same scope as the test for the before each, and the before all and after all run in an upper scope. So if you have some work that is in a test and you move it to before each, there should be no change for you regarding to how you assign variables and so on. So it should just work. If you move it to before all, you have to be a little careful about where you assign variables, because if you assign some variable in your test that you need to use in your after all, it won't be written there because the after all is running in an upper scope. You can go around this by creating an object or a hash table and assigning it in the before all, and then writing the value from the test, and then reading the value in the after all, because in that case, you are passing a reference to an object around instead of just writing a variable based on the PowerShell variable rules. So small example, here we have a test that's testing this function called create user. I know that's very generic, but the purpose of this function is to create some user somewhere and also assign the user to the correct group. We are running against a test system, but against a live system. So before that, before we assign the group, we need to create it. And that's what we can do in this before all block. We create a group, we assign it a random name. I didn't write a function to generate a random name, but the 083 and so on is supposed to be like a random name. And then we run our tests using the it block, and then we make sure that we remove the group. So we have the group, and then we created a before each, which will create a new test user for each of those tests. So it will run before each of the tests will start, and we will get a new user for each test. So we assign the username, so we can use it in the after each. We create the user, and then we run the test. And then after the test is finished, we will remove the user. In this case, we assign the username in before each, but we could also assign it inside of the it. Like if you are creating a file or something that you need to create inside of your test and then you want to clean up, those all 3 blocks all run in the same scope, so you can totally do that. As I said, the goal is if you have some code here and you move it here, it shouldn't change. One more point about before all. Before all in Pester 5 is used to import your tested function on the top of your file. People usually put it on the top of their file, even though you can also put it inside of the first describe. And there you would do something like this. You would use a dot sourcing operator, which will bring the functions in the current scope and not remove them afterwards. And then you use the path to your current file. And it's probably called something like getplanets.tests.ps1. And you want to grab from that the file name for the actual script that has the real function, in this case, get-planets.ps1. So you just replace the tests inside of the name. One word of caution, this replacement is case sensitive, so make sure that your files are named correctly. It will also help you later if you decide to run your tests on Linux, because there you have case sensitive file system. So just be aware of this. There is an alternative to use -replace, but that's regex, so this dot needs to be escaped. So that's also complicated. And now mocking, which is a little scary for people for some reason. If you spend enough time delving into the actual code of mocking, I totally understand why it is scary. And it can result in weird behavior if you're using different modules, import them, and so on. But on the top, for the everyday usage, it's really a simple idea. And with all the integration that we have for VS Code and all the logging that I wrote there for mocking, you will hopefully have not that many problems working with mock. Also in the previous releases, somewhere around version 5.2 or 5.3, we changed the rules around the mock definition. So now you can actually understand what is happening instead of being kind of randomly depending on whether you find the function in some scope and so on. So now there are rules that you can rely on. So how mock works, or how is it used? The whole reason to have mocks is that you can isolate your system from some external dependencies by replacing them with your own behavior. And we will go into this in more detail, but in this case, you can see me define the mock for the invoke-rest method. And that says, call the mock function, give it the name of this other function, and then give it the mock with block, which in this case is an empty script block, which says, when this function is called, do nothing. Then I call my function that's called get Github Summary, and that internally calls invoke rest method. Once we get to that point, it will call the mock and it will do nothing. And then I can go there with my assertion, which is called should-invoke. And I can check the table of all the mocks that were invoked and filter on a table that has parameters for each of those calls. And I can check if there's at least one that had the method get, and if the URI was like api.github.com. If there is no such call, I will get an exception. If there are more calls, it will pass. I can also say -exactly1, and it will only pass if there is exactly one such call. I can definitely be more specific about the URI, and you will see that in my example, but I don't want to go into way too much details in this at this point.
Just a quick question there, yeah, if you don't mind.
Yep.
The invoke parameter takes the name of the mock, right? And then we're testing the value of the parameters passed to invoke rest method within that function. Is that what parameter filter is doing? It's making sure that the method variable was get, and that when it was called, also the URI was api.github.com.
Yes, that's true. I have a better example for this in one of the examples, but what happens is that invoke rest method has multiple parameters. One of them is method,
Right.
and another is -URI. And we look at the metadata of each command, and we create variable for all of those. So we basically copy the parameter sets for that whole function. And then inside of your parameter filter, you can use those variables to check what the value of the dash method was, or what the dash URI was when you called it, like what you provided.
Got you. Yeah, okay.
The mechanism behind being able to replace functions in PowerShell is the PowerShell command precedence. You have this order which says if you have something in your script, it will be resolved in this order. First, we will parse it and look at it if it's a keyword or an operator. So even if you define a function that's called if or that's called -eq, it will never be picked up because the if keyword will always be picked up first. Then there are aliases, which is what mocking is relying on. Then there are functions, commandlets, and native Windows commands, like when you call notepad.exe. And so what we do is that we rely on aliases being second, and we cannot mock if because that's first. And we will do something like this. We will look at invoke rest method. We will look at the definition of that function, get the parameter set, get all the info. We will define another function with the same parameter set, which is called pester underscore invoke method something something something. And we call that a mock hook, if you ever hear me mention that. And then we create an alias for that method, for that function. And we call it invoke-rest method and point it at the hook. And we also create multiple other aliases. So if you call invoke rest method with the fully qualified name, which I'm not really sure what it would be right now, but something like PowerShell dot commandlet utilities, whatever, slash invoke rest method, then we already created an alias for that as well. If you would be mocking Notepad, we would create notepad.exe. So whatever syntax you use, we will end up calling the mock, as long as it is defined in the correct scope. And that's the basics of mocking. Just replace a function with your own behavior and have an assertion that can look back at it if you need. And the next one is Invoke Pester. This is your entry point for running your tests. Even though if you are in VS Code, you rarely use Invoke Pester to invoke your test, but you will use it in your CI integration pipeline or for experimenting. And by default, it invokes all test files in the current folder and all the subfolders. There are so many ways to customize this. You can look up the paths yourself. You can give it a pattern like I do for invoke pester star unit.tests when I want to run just unit tests. And you can also give it -output detailed, which will show you not only entry for a file when it passed an error, but it will show you all passing tests. This is nice if you are just starting and you accidentally write tests that just pass, then you can see what happened on the screen. If you are then putting it in your CI pipeline, you most likely don't want this output to be detailed because then you get all the output for like all passing tests and you usually don't care about that. It's much easier to see what happened if you just have failing tests and if you have confirmation that all tests inside of a file passed just by writing the whole path and plus sign. But for local interactive usage, output detailed is pretty nice, I think. I use it myself as well. So do we have any questions in the chat? I'm going to blow my nose in the meantime, muting myself.
Yeah, absolutely. We do. Yeah. So Terry asked a moment ago around the parameter filter for should and the invoke when you're marking. So the question was around specifically that variable method. I think it looks like a variable because it's actually the parameter that was passed within the mock, right? If you go back to that that parameter, you're still muted. I don't know if you know, but if you go back to that slide where you had the there. So method looks like a variable, but it's actually checking what the value of that parameter was when it was called, right? Am I on the money there, or roughly?
So it is a variable, and what happens technically here is that the mock will, when it executes the mocked function, like when it executes the body, or inside of the hook, it captures the input parameters that you provided to invoke rest method when you called it.
Right.
That will end up through the alias calling the hook. the hook will take the PS-bound parameters and save them in a hash table somewhere, together with the name of the function invoke rest method. And then when you go back and you call should invoke, you will invoke this parameter filter on each item in that table, and we will define the same parameters that you would get in the invoke rest method parameter set for you. So the method is actually a variable, and we set it to the value that you've set it to when you were calling invoke rest method. So like from the captured PS bound parameters, we just split that on that other function and call it with this block. So you will end up having method variable equal to get or equal to post or equal to put or whatever. And the URI will be equal to the full path that you provided when you called invoke rest method. And if we find such entry in the table, then we will increment the counter and then we will compare that with the expected number. In this case, 1 or more.
Gotcha. I hope that helps, Terry. Yeah, that's clearer for me. Thank you. I selfishly have a question, and it's something back earlier on when you were dot sourcing the body of the script or the test, I think it was. So you were dot sourcing the script.
Be this one.
Yeah. So the way I structure my modules is that I put the public functions in their own script files, and I name the script file the function. I do that for the private ones too. But if I dot source a public function and it uses a private function, that I'm not pulling in the private function in that scope because I'm only dot sourcing the script file of the public function. So I guess in a roundabout way, I'm asking you, maybe you'll get to it at some point. If you are, I'm sorry, but what's the ideal way to import a module that you're going to just test one public function?
Yeah, so that would be how you would do it for a module. You would import a module probably with force, and you would get the whole module imported. You don't have to do it with force, but it makes it easier for interactive use if you're developing in Visual Studio Code, for example. And then you just use the function that the module exports. In the later code, I faced this exact issue when writing those examples, where you have functions that are internal and have dependencies on each other. That's difficult with just importing the PS file, and you also don't probably want to import the whole module and then go inside of the module and run like inside of the module scope. So what I ended up doing is that I reach inside of the module, grab that single function and just export it outside of that module. So when I call it, it will actually run inside of the module, but all of my code around won't see the internal state of the module. So if your module on the top would define, I don't know, $ID, that would be 1, I wouldn't be able to see that in my test code because I'm acting only like the private function is exported. So I'm running outside of the module, but using this exported function to call to the inside of the modules. The code for that looks terrible. It's like 2 lines of terrible code, but I hope to get to a better pattern because this is a problem that everybody is facing, I think. So yeah, as long as you would have functions that have no dependencies, or you plan to mock out all the dependencies and redefine those functions, then just importing the PS1 that ends up being imported into your module would work just fine. Okay. But it's very unwieldy and it's very refactor unfriendly.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to throw you off. There is one more from Ben in the chat. Maybe you can cast your eye over it as well if you can. But effectively, Ben's asking, if I have a function that is supposed to import a certificate on a remote server, how would you test that? Would you need a server to test on, or is there some way to simulate that sort of thing?
That depends on the confidence that you want to have in importing the certificate and about how much you do with the certificate stuff afterwards. So in my examples that we will get to, I pretty much have like 3 levels of testing One is my acceptance test, where I'm actually calling the live system, I'm giving it some token, and I'm grabbing the information, and I try to get the result on like the happy path. So I know when I call the server, we actually have the correct address, we have some token that authorized us, we get the real live data, and we can parse them and we can translate them to the information that we want to have on the screen. And I test like all of this. The only problem with this is that you don't know what data are on the server. So my test around the actual summary that I get back is very vague. Like it will be a string with 3 parts, and each of those parts is something like a number. It will actually, the test I have now will break once we fix all issues because it expects a number that's bigger than 0. And but I'm able to test all this infrastructure. But in my integration test, I'm first capturing data of live system so I know what it would send back to me. So I can be sure that I can parse it, at least at this point in time, as long as GitHub doesn't break this API. And then I have another test, which tests the tiny piece between me calling invoke web request and not actually wanting to call GitHub. So I believe if I call invoke web request with the correct parameters, it will give me the correct data as long as the service is up and I have token, right? But I'm not trying to test the invoke web request function or commandlet. And that's as much as I can do. And I do it in those 2 parts because I have some logic that I want to test to make sure that I'm parsing the data correctly and translating them correctly. But at that point, I don't really care that much about calling the real system. But if there was no such piece and the whole reason for me to write this module or script was to be able to actually manage certificates on a server, I would probably set up a server and write it and test it against a live system with some testing certificate authority. So it really depends on what the goal is here.
That whole discussion.
That question, Ben.
Yeah, that whole discussion is interesting. When I first learned about mocking when reading the docs, because my first thought when I learned about it was, you if you're not careful, you could send yourself into a state where you could be testing against something that you're assuming is working okay. So say if you, that's arbitrary, right? But say if you had a script that tested against Active Directory, just loosely example, as a loose example, but something changed in Active Directory, something changed in the service which caused your code to no longer function as intended, and mocking could throw you down that path of being misled a little bit. So that whole discussion there is really useful to kind of think about what are you actually testing. Are you testing your reaction to the service or how you interact with the service, which again is high level, but it's, for me, it was a big realization being introduced to testing. You have to kind of be careful a little bit, I find. I don't know, would you agree with that? What are your thoughts?
Yes, and I have examples exactly for that.
Awesome.
Totally the same concern that I have.
Awesome.
Where were we? Invoke Pester, practical part, right? That's where I was heading to.
Just about to get there, I think, yeah.
Cool. So today, more real-life examples, not just calculators that do 1 + 1 = 2, because that's pointless for getting started, but it's easy. So here is some context first. I'm pretty sure almost everybody will be familiar with what I will show you because it's GitHub. But if it sounds unfamiliar, you don't have to really understand what I'm saying. It's just about translating some data into some numbers that will print on the screen. The module is pretty simple. So this is my example. I have this module, which is called Github Summary, and it exports a single function. It's called get GitHub Summary. I can give it a repo and I can give it some token. The token is represented now by $GH variable that I have defined in my profile. That's not a safe way to save your tokens, but let's not complicate this talk about having a safe way of saving your tokens. And I pass that to my get GitHub summary. It will go to GitHub and it will look at this data that you see on the screen using the GitHub API. It will tell me how many open issues there are for the repo I'm asking about, and that will be always Pester, how many pull requests there are that are open, and how many notifications I have that are unread for my repo. When I get the information back, I'm using Invoke REST method for it, and Invoke REST method is very useful and very helpful in grabbing this information from the GitHub REST API, which returns it to me as JSON, and then translating that into an object, which is a PowerShell object. So all of that is automatically done for me by using Invoke REST method. If you're not familiar with Invoke REST method, it's a commandlet for invoking HTTP requests against some resources on internet. And the resource is an address, the URI or URL as you know it. And on that place, we expect to have something that will respond to us. In this case, we want it to respond in JSON, which is implied here. And JSON is just text representation of an object, which you saw here. We are using different methods. In my examples, I will always be using get because I'm only getting data and not changing anything. And the token as well that I'm providing, it has only a single scope, which is notifications, because I'm only grabbing public information plus non-public information from my profile, which is notifications, just so you know if you set this up for yourself. And I'm passing it as an authentication bearer, meaning that we have the token and we passed it as a bearer token header for the authentication. All of this is handled for us using the Invoke REST method, which is built into PowerShell. And so we don't really need to test it. We only need to rely on it a little bit. The problem with the data that I get back is that it gives me slightly unfamiliar syntax. So instead of getting name capitalized, I will get name, which is not capitalized, which is not a big problem. And I will also get full underscore name instead of full name, which just makes my code tiny bit unfamiliar. And to make this example a little bit more complex, I want to translate the object from the one that you see on the left side to the one that you see on the right side. So instead of getting full underscore name, I would get full name. Instead of getting total underscore count, I will get total count, properly capitalized with all the right data. And that's everything that is there to the example. So we just query some GitHub API, we get back some information, and we try to validate as much around this in different ways as we can. So let's start with a task number 1, and that's just converting this full name to full name. If you look at my other presentations, we are doing something similar, but it's going the other way around. That's nicer code. This one is much more terrible, which is awesome because it should be a little complicated, not just adding 1 + 1 = 2. So our task is to have a function that's called convert to camel case, and we test it. That's the task number 1. So let me switch to my code. So I already wrote the code for you to test it, and it's pretty simple. This is, by the way, the hardcore way of exporting your function from a private module, from a private function from a module. I'm just going to comment this out and just replace it with the thing that you are used to, which is called a .ps command path replace .tests with nothing. And because I'm trying to highlight that there are unit tests and acceptance tests and integration tests inside of this code base, I'm actually using unit.tests, acceptance.tests, and integration.tests, which is also a very easy way for you to later filter them and only run unit tests if you want. You will just say invoke-pester star unit.tests.ps1, and you run all unit tests in your code base without any tagging or anything like that. So I find that quite useful. So I will actually replace unit tests with nothing. If I press this button, let's hope it will give me green output, and it does because I already implemented the function. So if you see execution of Pester for the first time, this is how it looks like. inside of Visual Studio Code, you just need to install the basic PowerShell extension, and it already has all of this built in. You will install Pester module, and you can then open your code and just click on the describe. If you have any test, it will execute it, and it will give you some results. In this case, both of the tests pass. And as I said before, this is detailed output. So let me show you also the setting. We have those two settings here, debug output verbosity, which is set to diagnostic. You should leave that there. And then you have output verbosity, which is by default set to normal. And if we run it like this, it will just tell us all the tests inside of this camel case unit tests passed. If we break test on purpose, or two of them, it will actually show us both errors. So it only sums up files that didn't have any failures. So you just see everything in this file was okay. But for you as a beginner, the detailed output, or maybe as a default in your VS Code, is better because then you see stuff as it is happening. You see that you had two tests, what do they do, the names and all of that. So I personally use it like this, but keep it on the normal view in my CI pipeline and other runs. So I will go ahead and just comment out all of this code in my other file and acting like I didn't implement a thing, just so you can see all the errors. I will run test, and it will say the term convert to camel case is not recognized at all. It's not a commandlet or function or script file or whatever. Meaning this function doesn't exist. You have to implement it. So uncomment this, get rid of all of this terrible code, which I won't remember because every time I implement this, it ends up being different. And now it says it converts from name to name. We expected name, but we got null. So the function is not returning anything. Let's try to make it happy. We will just say name. That will return name. So one of those tests should be happy. It will automatically save. And first test passed, the second one did not. What I want to also show you is this useful little arrow. If we change this to full AAA, the strings don't have to be the same size. It will tell you this is exactly, well, where the difference is. And if you have much longer string, it will cut it around the difference and point exactly at the point where it is, including enough context before and enough context after. As wide your window is, it will try to fit it in. One of my favorite features that I worked on. It's so small, but so useful. At some point, we didn't have this. We rolled it back, and it was a terrible experience. You couldn't say what's happening. Now it's much, much better again. So where did I break it? In the tested code. That's nice. So now let's try actually implementing this function. So I'm going to try to put it here on the side so we can see both of them and I don't have to switch that much. Run the test, still fails the same way. So what do I actually need to do? I see some underscore. First thing I'm thinking is let's split it on the underscore, or to get rid of the underscore and get the different words so we can capitalize them. So I will go with value split on underscore and run that. And it tells me the first test is happy, a little surprisingly, but okay. But the second one expected full name, but it instead got an array, which is full and name. So we use this to represent an array in multiple places. That's just how we try to translate it in the assertions, because even though you don't have to do it in your syntax, we think it's universal enough for you to think, oh, this is an array. And we do the same thing with hash tables, and we try to translate null to be like $, null, and so on. So this is not correct because I'm expecting name to be capitalized, and that's one of the reasons I want to have this function, but I suspect it's actually giving me name, which is not capitalized. We could go here, we could set a breakpoint, but some people just like to do write host, so I will do that as well. And I will just say write host words. And I want to be sure that that's what I actually wrote, so I will just add this little glyph in front of it, so it points it out. And then we can see this is what I output, that's the name, and this is full name. But we expected, oh, sorry, words, right? Return the value one more time. This passes, but it shouldn't be because it just gives me name that's not capitalized properly. So that's an error in my test. Actually, this assertion is case insensitive by default because it uses the EQ operator. So we need to be more specific and say be exactly, which is a weird syntax, but it just means the strings should be the same, including the case. And we run it again, and we get a failure again in the first test, which is what we expect. So just constantly check if what you are getting is not just my goal is to have green tests, but my goal is to have green tests that are correct. I will delete this write host, and we can work on each word separately. So I will do for each. I'll say word, words. And I want to somehow capitalize the first letter, so I will try to just say word 0, which should be the first character. Oh, come on. To upper. And then the rest should be word 1 till the end of the string. I know that this won't work because that's unfortunate, but it doesn't work in PowerShell the way you would expect to give you like from this to the end. So I need to do $word length -1. And that should give me the whole word. You will see that's not the case because it tells me the system chart doesn't contain method to upper. So I just look at what's specific in this error. It's the to upper. I only call it here. So what's happening? It talks about char, which is a single character. So I probably returned a single character here, and it doesn't have the method. The method is present on a string though, so I can just change this to a string and finally start making the code more terrible. We can do it like this. We can also cast it to string, whatever we want to do. Run it again, and now I get a different error. It says this failed because system object array doesn't contain a method that's called op subtraction. Op subtraction is just a .NET way of saying the minus on this is not implemented, so it's probably this. And what seems to be happening here is that I'm generating an array here, which says 1 to 9, or however long the word is. And so I will get something like this, 1, 2, and then I try to -1 on it. Same error. So I probably need to add more parentheses. Not here, but actually here. So it does the math first, and then it gives me the array. I run it, and I finally got some input. It tells me NA, then space, then whatever, then I get the same name in an array. So that looks like I'm just not joining the strings correctly. There is this default OFS variable in PowerShell which has space. So if you join any array, it will concatenate it together with spaces. So let's confirm that again. And we just say join the other way around, actually. Oh no, that's not what I wanted to do. String like this. That's what's happening. We get 1 space 2. And so I probably need to add some joins somewhere because actually what's happening is that this becomes a string. This plus sign is saying, oh, what do I see on the left side? That's a string. So all of this will be string as well. So it just creates a string from this and it will concatenate it with the previous one. So this will get spaces and this won't get spaces. And we end up with this weird name. So let's add join. And we just join it with nothing. I could have put it on the start, but I forgot. And we finally get name. Now we need to solve the other one. We get correct words, but we get them as an array. So we need another join. And this is getting more and more fun by the minute. So we try to do the same thing here. And it fails because this is not correct PowerShell syntax. But you can force it to be by using an expression, or actually a sub-expression operator, which is $ and parentheses. So we tell it first find this, and then give me the result and join it with nothing. And we finally get the result. I definitely want to see your solutions because every time I write it, it looks differently, and there's probably some amazing, easy code to do this, but it works. I wouldn't want to like debug this or look at this without having tests, but it works. It passes our test. We can throw nulls at it and it will probably fail and we will have to add more code, but it works. So we have some working implementation and we can move on. If you squint and if you don't care that much about the code being spaghetti code, as it's called in the chat, then what you should see is that we did something like this. We have an input and output that we check, and in the middle there is a function that doesn't look at anything else apart from its input and its output. And this you could call a pure function because it only takes input, it only produces output, it doesn't do anything else, it doesn't store anything else anywhere else. If you wrote to log, I would still consider it a pure function. If it had no impact on the output, you could still test it totally the same way, just not care about some of the aspects. And this is very useful pattern to have and to write your functions like this. If you can just give it some data, do something on it, and then get the data back, it's very easy to test. You don't have to use any mocking. You don't have to do anything special. You just feed it the correct input and you check if the output is correct. So this is our first pattern for a test. Now a second task, composing the summary. And if we approach this in the easiest way and started by looking at just the get summary function, it is again a pure function. It only accepts strings and creates the output. But we don't want to do that because in real life system, we rarely get to a situation where we only can compose it from like small pure functions because PowerShell is about integrating with real systems, like calling your Azure Active Directory, calling your Azure services, calling REST APIs on GitHub like I'm doing. You probably don't want to test your internals too much, as long as you know that if I do this, it will give me the correct output, because then you can refactor easily. I can rename all my internal functions and most of my tests will probably run. I'm looking way too much even into this module just to be able to show you some of the pieces. So compose the summary. Have functions that provide each piece and call real system, and then replace them with mocks to get repeatable output that can be tested. That's very generic. It looks like this in my code. So I have this get GitHub Summary integration test. And sometimes when it's too difficult to read the test, you should start from the bottom. So I scroll to the bottom and I can show you that.
The slide.
Oh yeah, that's good. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That happens to me a lot. So I already scrolled down in the test, and the last line says actual should be exactly Pester, which is the name of the repo, 156 issues, 14 pull requests, and 25 unread notifications. That's what I want to see. That's what I consider success. Then above that, I have call to the actual function, which is called get GitHub Summary. I give it the repo. and I give it some token. The token is fake. It's generated right on the line above. And now I want to prevent myself from calling the real API, but I still want to be able to know that when I call the real API, it will work. And that's the same discussion we had before. Like now I'm adding a seam, I'm reducing the fidelity with the real system, but I also want to be able to test my function as many times as I want for free without running into consumption limits, without paying for each request, even though in this case you have like 5,000 requests per hour that you can use, but it's not useful. And it's also preventing you from knowing what the data are. So if I now ask the GitHub API how many issues there are, maybe there are 3 more. Maybe while I'm giving this presentation, someone noticed something and added an issue. I cannot hard code that in my test because I have no idea apart from the repo name what this data will be. So what I did is that I actually called the API, and because it's JSON and because this is PowerShell, it's super easy for me to save the data into files. And that's what I did. I have this Pester file. It includes the date, so I can check with it if something fails. I can look back and see this is the data that I got before at this time. This is the data that I'm getting now. Why is this different? Did GitHub make a breaking change? Did they just started returning different version by default? That's why I have the date. And the data really are just JSON. We will actually be just using this total count from the top, even though we will refer to it as total count without the underscore and properly capitalized. We have the same info for PRs, 14, and we have some notifications. Some of them are unread, some of them are not. So we will filter them first, and then we will count them and put it into the output. So how do you prevent yourself from calling the remote system? First, you should isolate the function that you want to call and just add this throw do not call invoke rest method or whatever you want to do, because that will give you an easy way of getting fast feedback without actually querying the data or the server by accident. In this case, we would still get 403 unauthorized because we don't have valid token. But why call the API at all when we can just fail locally? So this just helps me to say, if for some reason I call invoke rest method without matching any of those parameter filters, throw an exception, because then it's easy for me to look it up in my output. So for example, to show you an example, I will add some dashes in here just to make sure that won't be in the actual URL that I captured. So it won't be matching the URL that I use internally for this data. And then I run the test and it should tell me, do not call the real invoke rest method, because I ended up in here by accident. That's the whole point of this guard mock. And then I want to add more mocks, but now I have a problem. I'm calling invoke rest method and I'm using the get method in all cases, but I'm calling the invoke rest method 3 times. And I want to distinguish which resource I'm looking at. Am I trying to grab issues now? Am I trying to grab PRs? Am I trying to grab notifications? If we switch to the actual code, which is in here, we can see that this get Github Summary is implemented like this. We have this helper function called get issues, get PRs, get notifications. We filter them out, pretty simple. And then we have get summary, which just composes all the output. Just creates a string. And if we go to get PRs, we can see that it has the URL hard-coded and it contains this is PR. And it inserts the repo name. I just copied that from some examples. And we have a similar function, even though it's not split up into a different file, which is called get issues, that has this is issue, and this one get notifications, which has notifications in the URL. So we will use that to differentiate between the different mocks. So we can give them different behaviors, meaning we will return different contents of different files. And that's why we have this parameter filter here. So we say, if we call this and it's a get method, then it's okay, check the URI. And if it contains isIssue, then return this output. If it doesn't, try the next one, which would be this one and this one. And if none of them match, then go here, because that's the default mock, and throw an exception. And so that's what happens here. We define all of those mocks, and we end up in this call get GitHub Summary. We call it. It will go inside of get issues or get PRs. It will call invoke rest method, which is mocked at this moment. And we invoke it. It will internally try to look up the correct behavior based on the parameter filter. And if it cannot find any, it will go to the default one that we defined and throw an exception, because that's what we said should happen. You can also see this in practice, because we have this nice integration with Visual Studio Code. And if you click debug, it will automatically switch into the diagnostic mode, and it will print all of those information to the screen. So you get additional info about your discovery and then about mocking. I put breakpoint in here on purpose, because all of this info here is about definition of those mocks, because we haven't called any mock yet. Clean that up so we have easier time seeing the rest of the output. And then I'm going into the get GitHub Summary function, and that will end up calling invoke rest method. I can also put a breakpoint in here if I want to see that it actually reaches it. So you can also debug the internal parts of your mock. But what you would see here in the output is that it tries to search for the log. And it says, I have those behaviors. I'm adding it to the parameterized behavior list. Parameterized mean it's not the default mock. And it has this body, this filter. Is the default? No, because it has a filter. It's verifiable, which is a different feature of mocking that we won't go into. And then we try to invoke the mock, and we can see that here, which says finding behavior to use that passes the filter or a default. We are running a mock filter, and that says this is the mock filter, method eq get, and URI is notification with this context, meaning the data that you passed to the invocation, and the authentication was better, the method was get, the URI was this URI, and it's improperly formatted, I just noticed, but it should be exactly the string that you passed. And then the token was this secure string. And this mock filter returned false because notifications don't match the isIssue. So we go to the next one, try ispr, same result, it's false. Then we go to the next one, it says it should be like isIssue, and we say, yes, that matched. And the filter passed. So we will invoke the body of that mock, and that's exactly where we ended up. We found the mock based on the parameter filter, based on the parameters that you provided, and we now try to invoke it by getting the data, converting them to JSON, and returning back. And that's exactly what happens. It also happens for all the other mocks, and we end up with a passing test because we did everything correctly and all of the code is implemented. And so this is another pattern where you have some data that you need to mock out, where you have some external system that you need to isolate from, because you are doing some processing on the return data. You are doing some processing on what you got from the system, and you don't really care if the JSON that you got is from live GitHub, as long as it's similar to what you would normally get. And that's why we record it first, save where we recorded it, and then we try to do some assertions on it. If you look at our pattern, we can see that we have mock that provides some data to a function, and then we have output that we validate. So we add seams, but we reduce some fidelity. So We are no longer sure that what we are doing will work for the real system. The next step is to actually ensure that we are calling the GitHub API correctly, because we believe that if we invoke REST method with the correct parameters, it will work and it will get us the PRs. Same for get issues and get notifications. We know that invoke REST method is a built-in command, and we believe that it's tested enough that it will work as long as the system on the other side is on or working or accessible, and as long as we have correct token. But we want to make sure that we are calling it correctly, passing the token and everything. For that, we have this unit test, which shows us another usage of mock. And we can run those tests. And it also shows us how to use before all. So here I'm again doing the ugly code for exporting a single function from a module.
We still see the slide.
Code.
Sorry. Awesome. That's better. Okay. Thank you.
Let's rewind. So I opened the get PRs unit test PS1. It has unit tests and shows us different usage of mock. The one that we saw first, where we have an empty mock, and then we ensure that we called it correctly. So here I'm just doing the same thing to export that single function from the module. This will hopefully become a nicer pattern later. We call the describe get PRs, and we define a mock in the before all that's inside of the describe, so it will be effective for all the tests inside of the describe. And then we define some token. This is a warning that is from PScript Analyzer because it doesn't understand our scoping rules, but you don't have to care about this because it will be inherited to this test. It's just, as a PowerShell code, this shouldn't happen, but because of the magic we do internally, it works fine. Then we call the get PRs function, and we don't really care about the output. We pass some parameters, and then we do should invoke on it. And we do invoke REST method to filter down the calls to just invoke REST method. We insert it inside of Github Summary module. This is very important for the mock to be actually active inside of the module. And then we say the parameter filter, the method that we called should be get. So we would get all the calls to invoke REST method that were get. And then I have the same test for URL, and the same test for the token, and I could probably test the authentication and so on. And I'm also checking it was called exactly once. And the reason why I'm splitting those instead of using one bigger parameter filter is that it gives me better errors when it fails. The logging for should invoke is not in place yet, so I can't really look at the diagnostic log, and I wouldn't have it on the server. So I'm just trying to split it into multiple tests so I know this is not calling it with get, this is not calling it with the correct token, and so on. So overall, what this does is, yeah, that's what we actually wanted to do. And what this does is that we have some input, we call a function that calls a mock, and we provide the input and we assert that the mock was actually called in the correct way. So we are testing like the tiny piece between our own function that is actually calling invoke REST method, sorry. And if we believe that the call is correct and we can verify it manually against the server, then as long as it remains to be the same way, we believe that this will work. So far, we never touched the real system. So this is called behavior verification. You should do it carefully only for your edge functions. Don't do this for everything that you have in your script. It's a bit tempting because then you have a lot of tests. It looks like you have a lot of coverage. But as long as you have some good integration tests, this doesn't give you that much value apart from more maintenance, because every time you change something, your tests will break. And you don't want that because it doesn't have any impact on the output you are providing. And that's about everything that you can do with Pester. But let me show you also those acceptance tests that I mentioned a few times. I will switch to the code myself now. And this is my acceptance test. It actually calls the real system. It just calls get GitHub Summary, gives it some token. How would you save that in your actual pipeline? You probably would put it in the pipeline somewhere and get it from some vault or something. But here I'm just importing it as a variable from my profile. I run tests. It takes some time because it's calling the real system, and it grabs way more data than it should for this simple summary. And then I just look at those parts. And as I said, I don't know much about the real data that I will get back. So I'm just trying to check, is this kind of the correct output? Did I get a string that has 4 parts? Is each part bigger than 0? Because I probably will have issues and will have notifications and will have PRs. Is the name of the repo correct? And that's about as much as I know about the data that come back. But what I also know now is that when I call this method, it will actually reach out to the real system. It will use my token for authentication. It is able to give me some data. I just don't know much about what data it gave me. I just know they resemble something that I would want. And yeah, that's about it. So next steps. You can visit my Pester playlist on YouTube. There are multiple different talks, introduction to Pester from multiple different angles. And the talks are also ordered to progress in difficulty. So you start from the most beginner ones and go further and further into the more details and internals if you want. You can check out Pester test report to visualize your tests on GitHub, which is a GitHub action. You can check out Pester Test, which is a plugin for Visual Studio where you would get a graphical view of your tests. Maybe that will work or maybe that won't. It's still in preview, but it's pretty useful, and Justin did a great job on doing that. And then you can also consider sponsoring me or Pester on GitHub if you wish. Just go to my GitHub profile and click sponsor if you want, or just follow on Twitter, or both. And Adam also told me that he will be preparing some talks where he will tie together the CI and GitHub and Pester, and hopefully that will come out soon. So I'm looking forward to that because I myself use Azure DevOps more, but this module cannot run CI on Azure DevOps when it's querying GitHub, right? Summary. Here are a few common shapes of tests that you should learn about. I tried to highlight all of them in this talk. If you use mocks, use them cautiously and record them from the live system. And Pester is just a bunch of functions with weird names. So experiment with it and you will get errors or not. And just experiment and have fun. That's it. If you want the code for this, then it's on my GitHub. It's in the same repo as the previous ones. The code for the previous ones is also available. It's just on a different branch called 2017. And the code for this one is on the main. It should have all the info. I will make sure that I will push from the repo where I have my code to the public repo, so you have all the latest updates. And yeah, that's it. All pretty long.
That's
Questions
awesome.
and answers now.
Yeah, absolutely. We did actually have a little something prepared. Am I coming through okay? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Yeah, you can hear me. It's just that I think OBS for some reason or another is not moving the bar up when I speak. Let me just turn the stream off. Yeah, they can hear me. Okay, cool. No, sorry, I was just getting confused there. Anyway, yeah, we did prepare something for people to join. Let me just kind of share something real quick. Let me switch screen to window capture, and I have to change the window I'm showing, change it to Notepad, this one. Yeah, in the browser, jump to this URL here, acook.io/pester, and that would bring you here into this Teams meeting. So if you want to join kind of live questions, don't want to do it in the chat, just, you've got some questions for Jakub or about Pester, jump in or ask it in the chat if you prefer. But by all means, jump in. We'll let you in, and we can just have a quick chat here. But while we wait for people to join, I have a few questions, Jakub. You used a couple of terms, and I kind of feel a little bit noobish for asking it, really, because I don't consider myself a developer. My job daytime is support, and I tool make on the side and to kind of to automate auxiliary tasks as part of my job. But terms that you use, I feel like, are quite developer centric. So when you talk about mocking, you use words like seams and fidelity. What does that mean?
Those are actually not real terms, or they are in some testing books. So what I mean by a seam is something that you can use to split up your code at some point. So if you have a module that is doing the stuff that I'm doing, then you have no real way in PowerShell without mocking to remove the actual call to invoke web request. Like without all the magic that we do to insert functions inside the correct module and making sure that we remove them afterwards and so on, you don't really have a way of replacing the function call to invoke REST method in
Right.
like vanilla PowerShell, in like normal PowerShell that you would normally write. So a seam would be something that you can easily, like in a clothing, like you can easily tear the part. And if you tuck on a part on the shirt, it will probably split at the seam. So
I
adding
see.
seams would mean you can isolate one part from the other without actually
Got you.
ruining the whole thing. Yeah.
Got you. Okay.
And the other one was fidelity.
Hmm.
That's probably just me not being a native speaker. I mean, it's it can be different from the real world. It can be different from what you would actually get from the real system. So
Okay.
like that's why you try to record it from the real system and maybe update your data from time to time, just so you know that the system that is remote will give you the same data instead of you coming up and trying to write down the JSON yourself. You will rather record it from the system so you know it was correct at least at one point in time.
Okay. Thank you. Awesome. Got a couple of people in the lobby. I'm just going to let them in. Going to let Terry in. Currently admitting. I don't know if Teams is delaying on telling me. Hey Terry, what's up? Can you hear us?
Yeah,
Hi.
How's it going?
grand.
Awesome. Got any questions? Any questions, Terry? You wanted to ask? Jakub?
No.
No. Okay. No worries. I got. I think it's pronounced. Sorry if I pronounce your name wrong, but Ifiok. Just letting you in. You can come off mute and fire away by all means, Ifiok.
Hi.
You're on mute currently. I don't know if you know that, Ifiok. No. Okay. Well, don't be shy. Yeah, if you haven't already, you're watching, join, and yeah, it's probably a rare opportunity, right, to have like a one-on-one, I guess, with probably one of the most widely popular PowerShell testing frameworks that was kind of thrown into Windows, you said early on, right? And it's like boom, exploded. So yeah, rare chance. I guess I have a couple more questions again on like phrases and definitions, and would
Sure,
you
go
be able
on.
to kind of would you be able to kind of at a high level like you went into kind of detail giving example tests between these, but unit integration and acceptance testings, if you were to kind of like at a high level define each of these, I know you kind of gave some examples, but like if you were to try and define those for a novice like me, what would you say?
So there are no like real definitions for this that you could apply everywhere, but the acceptance tests, as I understand them, mostly actually deal with the real system, whatever meaning you have for a real system. Oh, I'm actually scrolling back for some reason. And the definition of the real system can also vary. So in the answer that I gave before about the certificates and integration and like trying the certificates, if you dealt directly with the certificate, with the operating system that has the certificates, that would probably be your acceptance test. You are calling out to some real system. It's doing the real thing that you would normally do. And it usually comes with the same downsides I had in those examples. You don't know much about the data that you will get back, especially if you are querying online services that are live. And you don't know much about like what exactly happens on the system, which state the system is in. Maybe you are like not being random enough in creating those certificates, so you run into conflict. That's not something that you expect, or it's something that you actually really need to handle, like it happens for your users all the time, that they start your tool and you are already having like configuration for some different sessions saved somewhere, or you already have certificate that you are trying to always install and it's failing because it's already there. So acceptance tests would be like small scenarios of the stuff that represents your system. For me, it's getting a summary from GitHub. For a system that deals with certificates, it might be being able to install a certificate to a system and remove it from a system. As long as this works, you are reasonably confident that your whole system will somehow work, but you don't really test all of the exact edge cases scenario. That's what you have your unit tests and your integration tests for. Then in the integration test, like a lot of the tests that you will write in PowerShell will probably be integration tests. That's something that you will end up with unless the function is pure, like it only accepts input and only gives you output. You will probably end up writing some kind of integration test for it, where you will connect through some other commandlet to some resource, or maybe you will use our test drive, the directory that we automatically create for you in temp, and delete it after your test has run. So you can very easily test with files. There is the same thing for registry, or maybe you will invent a similar thing for yourself when you are testing against certificate store. So that would be your integration test probably on your own system. So it tries to just grab the resources that are either local or replace the resources with something that's being faked by mock. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have the unit test. And those probably will be only for like a single function or for some single unit that does a single thing. So for example, in my code, you could see that we are converting the name from the full underscore name to full name. And that's only a small part of the functionality. The bigger part is actually doing it on every property on an object. And I could consider those like a single unit, even though they are two different functions. And it's much easier for me to like test one function and then test both of them at the same time, because they will give me the whole behavior. There is not much benefit from cutting out the convert to camel case from the convert whole PS object to camel case, because it's very easy for me to test it in both ways. And so I would consider that still a unit test, even though if it was two different functions. So yeah, sorry for the kind of blurry definition, but if you touch live system, it's probably your acceptance test, and you will probably not do it for everything that you try to do, like get it into error state or whatever. If you stage a system to get it into error state, it's probably more like an integration test. And if you're just going in your code and just testing some stuff that is a function or two functions, or like translation of output or input to some other output, that's most likely a unit test.
No, that was good. Thank you. That's really good insight. Thank you. Yeah, like I said, just picked it up, and this sort of session's perfect for me, and I hope it for others as well. Just kind of cozy with PowerShell, but the whole concept of testing, and Brett kind of put it really well earlier in the chat. The idea of testing is like a paradigm shift, and if you're just broaching it, a lot of these phrases are new. And no, that was really helpful for me. I hope it was helpful for everyone else. But yeah,
Awesome.
no one really joined the Teams meeting, which is okay. I guess there's no more questions in chat, so I guess we'll wrap up. So I'll just thank you, Jakub. I really appreciate your time. I know we ran over a bit, and I hope that doesn't throw you off too much on your evening. Won't keep you for much longer, but that was really helpful for me, especially. I really enjoyed that. That was great. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Glad to hear that. You're welcome.
Yeah.
It's a great pleasure to be presenting about Pester.
Awesome.
And I wish you good luck with your presentation once you have it. I think next
Yeah.
time, or next week, or in a month. I will try to attend that.
That's a really good point. So it's with WinAdmins. Let me kind of share that out real quick. It'd probably be a good idea if I did, right? Let me change the to the browser here in the screen share. There we go. Let me move it up a bit. There you go. So how do I find the event? So it's on WinAdmins. It's next month, and it's going to be about, again, Pester, like an introduction to Pester. I don't intend to rewrite what Jakub has done, but it's also going to be like with a focus on kind of implementing it into your CI/CD pipeline as well. So its title is Breaking the Ice with Pester. It's on March 15th, so next month. Definitely going to be taking everything I've learned from the docs and this session. Yeah, it would be great if you were there too, and maybe you could jump in as well. And if there's anything that I say that's immensely wrong, you can scream at me and say, Adam, you're stupid, that's wrong, don't say that. That'd be great. Cool.
Hopefully there won't be any need for it, and if there is, I will tell you in private.
Cool. Alrighty, so let's wrap up. Usual spiel for the end is, thanks, Jakub. Really appreciate your time. The recording for this will be available tomorrow. YouTube's got to do like some weird processing, and then it'll be available tomorrow. Call for speakers. Yeah, so want more content. If you want to give back to the community, if there's something that you feel like you've done recently that's worth sharing, doesn't have to be a whole hour, doesn't even have to be half an hour. If you just want to share something out, I'd be more than happy to kind of help work with you to kind of be the platform for you to kind of do that. I'd be very interested in speaking with you if you have something you want to share. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. So, subscribe if you haven't already. Join the meetup group. So if you went to pssouth.co.uk, at the top, there's a meet out in the navigation bar. Join. And there is no session next. So it's that usual silliness with a stupid date and a stupid title with Jack Sparrow. There is no planned session next. But, hopefully someone reaches out and we can get something soon. But, we'll wrap up. Sorry it ran over, but really appreciate your time. Thank you, Jakub. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for having me.